These are the classes 20 through 11 as we wrap up this cycle here on National Signing Day. Now we go to the top 10 where you see a lot of red. Yeah, that red is the SEC. They have 7 of the top 11 classes in this cycle. Once again, just the SEC domination, but that doesn't seem to be the conversation that we're talking about, right? The SEC has missed out on the last 2 national championships, so of course the overrated chants start coming in, and then you have a signing day and you're reminded that the SEC is not going anywhere. So you see all the SEC there on that top 10. What does that tell you about the future of the conference?
Well, they're in good hands, which they have been for a long time. I think it brings it back to the earlier conversation that we had at the beginning of the show. Everybody else is starting to catch up. I think the other thing is when you look at these composite team rankings, there used to be a day not too long ago where you could look at these rankings and then say, you know what, it kind of tells me a little bit about the team or the direction of the program. But now you got to splice it together with the transfer portal as well because, you know, we like to call it draft and free agency, but the way teams are using transfer portal now, you're seeing higher quantities, and I think teams are starting to get the feel. The first couple of years was like we don't really know or understand the landscape. Now each team is forming an identity in the transfer portal, like a lot of these teams that we talked about. And it's going to be year to year. You're going to see teams like Texas Tech, LSU, who we're going to talk about here in a second, how they kind of manage their short-term and their long-term outlook of their roster. So no surprise to see the teeth of the rankings with a lot of SEC flavor in there. That being said, there are a lot of different ways to skin a cat now. It's not just a one-dimensional high school ranks. This is the way we're going to build it. So I would caution anybody out there that's just looking at the high school rankings and say, well, you know what, we got a top 10 team that equates to us being a playoff team. That's not necessarily true. And you look at a team like Notre Dame, you look at a team like Washington over the last couple of years, both those teams in the national championship, Notre Dame's done a really good job, but they haven't been like these elite top 5 classes. And you look at Washington, a little bit all over the place, right? Just in terms of how they did it. You add in Penix, Jalen Polk, a couple plug-and-play transfer portal starters. All of a sudden, you get the right fit of scheme, personnel, and the coaches from a development standpoint. And you never know when your year is going to be.
I think the other thing that jumps out is, the 32 5-stars, SEC leads the way, 17 of them. Big Ten with 10, though. I do think that's a little bit notable. ACC 4, Big 12 with 1 of them. Me and Cooper were talking about this on the 105. Yeah, you see that disparity in terms of how many of these blue chippers are going to the SEC. But the top 5 ranked quarterbacks, 4 of them are headed to the Big Ten. You got Bryce Underwood at the top. Number 2, Keelan Russell going to Alabama. 3, Tavian St. Clair, he's going to Ohio State. 4, Hassan Longstreet, he's going to USC. And then 5, Malik Washington going off to Maryland. So I just kind of think that's a bit interesting when we think, all right, quarterbacks long-term, what's next in terms of how these blue chippers and where all of them are going.
It's an indicator of future success. So all the fans of SEC teams watching are saying, yeah, see, we're not going anywhere. But the fans of other teams in different conferences are saying, could this potentially change? So maybe as we look to the future of college sports with the new rev share model, I mean, how could you see that potentially affecting the SEC's recruiting dominance in particular? People are shouting for parity.
Well, I think the SEC teams are only going to get more creative, right? You take a look at Georgia right now. I think what they're doing from a roster construction, salary cap management, I mean, they are getting so creative. They're finding ways to add players that, for us, have Power 4 signee rankings or group of 5 signee rankings. They're getting these guys in on partial scholarships, taking advantage of like in-state scholarship funds and finding ways to build out that roster. And, Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, all playoff teams are, teams that were in the playoff conversation down the stretch. All of them started walk-ons. And leaned on walk-ons in the secondary, walk-on safeties. Dan Jackson at Georgia, Michael Taff at Texas. So it's you have to get creative. And yeah, I think revenue sharing, name, image, likeness, it's going to even things out when it comes to the distribution of the prospects at the top of the board. But the programs that are in the best position are going to find ways to get even more creative when it comes to acquiring talent and building out a competitive roster. They're going to find ways to squeeze the most out of that 105.
I think parity is here. I know that's been a big topic, but I mean, you look at this last year, and I think we kind of gloss over the fact that Notre Dame was that team. We kind of looked at under Brian Kelly. It was like, all right, they've hit their ceiling. Are they ever going to be able to make that next step? Are they ever going to be able to beat Kirby Smart at his own game? They did that. And I think the parity is in the trenches. You look at Penn State as well. It's the same deal. Look at Ohio State toe-to-toe with Texas. Not only toe-to-toe, I mean, they beat them by 2 possessions, right? So Texas, one of the most talented teams in the country. That's one of the things. I mean, yeah, you can look at the talent composite and you can say, hey, this is the way that it stacks 1 through 5. And I think that would have been a really good indicator. And still, there's value in that. But there's other factors that are in play as well. And I think the biggest thing is the offense and the defensive line is not as, I would say, cornered of a market that it used to be in the SEC. And you see these big bodies. I mean, let's take a look at USC, right? And there's been a lot of criticism there. But look at them this cycle. And there's a lot of different opinions on this. They go out, they get Jakeem Stewart from Louisiana. Yeah, they must have paid a lot of money, but that's one way to acquire a player. They go out, they get one of the best defensive linemen in the portal, and Keshawn Silver, a former 5-star that they get by way of Kentucky. Then they add him with Jamal Jarrett, another guy that just kind of got phased out at Georgia. So they got beef. There's different ways for now these teams that used to be restricted to geographical footprints to go say, you know what, I'm going to find a way to get my hands on these guys no matter what. Dan Lanning's doing it in Oregon. The guys in South Bend have a different way of doing it, but it's still effective as well. So that's what's kind of fascinating to me. I think the great neutralizer of this game is in the trenches, and you're seeing those big bodies disperse coast to coast.
Yeah, and I love, too, that you mentioned the quarterbacks, because that was a big knock on the SEC. This year was their quarterback play, and it sounds like the future is not as bright as we're seeing that go to other schools. You mentioned the creativity. The Georgia Senate, they had a bill proposing that college athletes would be tax exempt from NIL money that is brought in. So there's a lot of creativity going there in the SEC schools. I'm sure that it's definitely something.
I wish we did that here.
Yeah, we should be income tax exempt too. Yeah, it's interesting to see, but yeah, the SEC is certainly here to stay.